A mail-order bride boarded the wrong train. She arrived in his town 3 weeks late. The letter came on a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesday was the day I drove the buckboard into Harlow for feed, and I'd been doing that every Tuesday for 11 years without anyone waiting on me to come back. So when Denton at the post office slid that envelope across the counter and said, "Looks like it's from the agency, Cal," and it was that same cream-colored paper with the Denver address, I didn't open it in the store. I put it in my shirt pocket and drove the buckboard home and fed the horses and made a fire and ate the cold biscuits I'd left on the stove that morning before I finally sat at the table and unfolded it. She wasn't coming. Well, that wasn't quite what it said. What it said was that Miss Vera Elliott of Copperfield, Ohio, had boarded the westbound Union Pacific on the 14th of March, and that the agency was deeply sorry to inform me that there had been some confusion of routing, a missed connection at a junction in Missouri, and that Miss Elliott had been rerouted through Kansas City, then south, and had arrived in Goodwater, New Mexico, which was not Harlow, Montana, by any reasonable geography. They were working to arrange her northward passage. They expected a delay of 2 to 3 weeks, perhaps a bit more, and they wished to assure me of their commitment to the arrangement. I read that letter twice, then I set it on the table and looked at the fire for a while. Here's what I need to tell you before any of the rest of this makes sense. I was 51 years old. I had been ranching the same 640 acres my father broke in 1859 since the year I turned 22, which was the year my father died of a chest, something the doctor in Bozeman couldn't name. I had never married. I had been engaged once to a girl named Constance Prout from over near Lewistown, but her family moved back to Illinois in the winter of '89, and that was the end of that, and I hadn't thought about it much in the years since. I had a dog named Roy who died in February. I had a hired man named Orrin Peck who was 63 and could still mend fence but moved slow, and we'd been working together going on 15 years and didn't talk much, which suited us both. That winter had been the kind that makes you count things, your horses, your wood, your money, yourself, and I'd done some counting and the number that kept coming up was one man, one set of tracks in the snow between the house and the barn, one cup on the table. One place where the lamp threw light against the wall and one place where it didn't, and I was always on the side where it didn't. So I'd written to the agency, felt like a damn fool doing it. Denton at the post office had seen me mail the letter and nodded like he understood, and I didn't know whether that made it better or worse. 3 weeks late, I refolded the letter, put it back in my shirt pocket, went to bed. I didn't tell anyone in town. Which means, of course, that within about 4 days everyone knew. I found this out when I came in for feed the following Tuesday, and Harlan Gibbs, who ran the hardware, stopped me on the boardwalk and said, "You hear anything more from that bride of yours?" in a voice that carried about as far as Harlan's voice generally carried, which was a considerable distance. I said no and kept walking. Walt Freeze, who owned the livery, gave me a look that I couldn't read except to know I didn't like it. Mrs. Dawson, the preacher's wife, caught my arm outside the dry goods and said she'd be praying for my situation, which told me that even the church knew. My situation. I drove home that Tuesday faster than I usually did. Orrin was replacing a board on the corral fence, and he looked up when I came in hot and didn't say anything, just went back to the board, and I appreciated that about Orrin. He was not a man who said things. 3 weeks turned into 4. The second letter from the agency said Miss Elliott had taken ill in Goodwater, nothing serious, a fever, she was being tended by a local woman, and that her departure north had been delayed again. They enclosed a partial refund of my arrangement fee, which I did not cash. I don't know exactly why. It just felt like cashing it would mean something I wasn't ready to mean. I went about my work. April came and the ground thawed, and there was fence to ride and calves coming and the usual mud that turns a ranch into something that looks like the floor of a river. Orrin and I worked from first light until we couldn't see, the same as every spring, and I'd fall into bed at night with my boots still half on and not think about much until morning. But I thought about her. Not the way you might think. I didn't know her. I had a photograph the agency had sent, a small oval print of a woman standing in front of what looked like a painted backdrop, a studio portrait, very stiff, the way they all are. She was looking at something just to the left of the camera, straight-backed, strong-jawed, maybe, or maybe it was just the angle. She looked like a woman who was used to making up her mind. I had looked at that photograph enough times that I'd stopped being able to see it fresh, the way you stop hearing a clock that's been ticking in the same room for years. And I thought, she's out there somewhere in New Mexico and she doesn't know a single thing about me. She agreed to come to a man named Calvin Drew in Harlow, Montana, and now she's 3 weeks late through no fault of her own and sick to boot. And she doesn't know if I've given up on the arrangement, if I've written to cancel, if there's even still a place waiting for her. And I hadn't written. The agency had my address. If I wanted to stop the arrangement, I could have written and stopped it. I hadn't written. I went and pulled out a piece of paper one evening in early April and wrote to the agency and said, I'm still here. If Miss Elliott still wishes to come when she has recovered, the arrangement stands. Please tell her the ranch will be ready. I don't know what made me write that last part. The ranch will be ready. Like I was promising something. Like I was talking to her directly through the agency's office on Larimer Street in Denver, talking to a woman sitting up in a borrowed bed in Goodwater, New Mexico, who probably had no idea what she'd be walking into. I folded the letter and took it to Denton on Tuesday. He didn't say anything. I respected him for that. She arrived on a Wednesday. I know it was a Wednesday because I'd been in the South pasture all morning and had lost track, and when I rode back in Orrin was standing in front of the barn with a look on his face that I hadn't seen before, and he said, Stage came. And I said, that's not Tuesday. And he said, it's Wednesday, Cal. Stage from Billings. There's a woman in the house. I sat on the horse for a second. He said, I didn't know what to do with her, so I put her in the house. She said she could wait. I got down off the horse. I was wearing my worst work coat. There was mud up to my knee. I had not shaved in 4 days because I'd been figuring she was still 2 weeks out, the last letter having put her arrival somewhere around the 20th. This was the 9th. Orrin said she took the stage 11 days early. Changed her route at Billings herself, is what she said. Figured it out on her own. I handed him my horse. I went to the pump, washed my hands and face. There was nothing I could do about the coat or the mud or the 4 days of beard. I knocked on my own front door, which I had never done before in my life, and felt the absurdity of that, and then opened it. She was sitting at my table with her hands folded on top of a small leather traveling case and her back to the window, and the afternoon light was coming in behind her, so for a moment I couldn't see her face clearly. She was dressed in dark blue. She was not what I'd expected, which I realized meant I'd been expecting something, which meant I'd been building her up in my head for 6 weeks without knowing it. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, You're Cal Drew. Not a question. I said, Yes, ma'am. She said, I'm Vera Elliott. I took a different stage than the one the agency arranged. I hope that isn't a problem. I said it wasn't. She said, I was told there would be someone to meet me. I said I wasn't expecting you until the 20th. I was in the South pasture. She looked at me another moment. Then she looked around the room, the table, the stove, the shelf of tin plates, the single chair by the fire, and then she looked back at me. Something moved through her face. I couldn't name it exactly. She said, It's smaller than I imagined. I said, Yes. She said, That's all right. I'm a practical woman. That first week was strange in the way that first weeks are, the two of you moving around a space that was built for one, everything slightly wrong-sized, neither of you sure where the edges are. Vera had her own way of doing things, which was different from my way, which was also different from no way at all, which was what I'd had before. She reorganized the kitchen on the second day while I was out. I came in to find the tin plates on a different shelf, and the flour in a different bin, and a cloth over the window. I'd never had a cloth over, and I stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment adjusting. She watched me do it. She said, If it bothers you, I can put it back. I said, No, it's fine. It was fine. It was more than fine, and I didn't know what to do with that yet. We were not married yet. That was to happen properly when Reverend Calloway came through on his circuit in 3 weeks. In the meantime, she slept in what had been the spare room, which I'd cleaned out and put a proper bed in when I got back the day she arrived. I did it while she was heating water for a bath, working quick so the bed would be there when she needed it. I don't know if she noticed that I'd done it quick. She didn't say anything about it. Orrin watched the whole arrangement from a careful distance and kept his face neutral. I appreciated that about Orrin. The town was less neutral. I came in for feed the following Tuesday, old habit, couldn't shake it, and Harlan Gibbs was waiting on me practically at the wagon. She here, he said. The bride, she arrive? I said yes, and he wanted to know what she looked like and where she was from, and I answered the questions that seemed answerable and left the ones that didn't. At the dry goods, Mrs. Dawson found me again, and this time she was more specific. I heard she came early, changed her stage on her own. I said that was true. Mrs. Dawson looked at me with an expression I couldn't decipher and said, "Sounds like a capable woman," in a tone that meant something more than the words. Walt Freeze at the livery. You know she came in on the Billings stage and told Jed McArdle she didn't need any help with her bags. I said I'd heard. He said, "What kind of woman does that?" I said, "Her kind, apparently." Walt Freeze gave me another look, this one different from the one before, and said, "You seem all right about all this." And I said I was, and he nodded slowly like he was filing something away. I'll tell you what kind of woman she was. She was the kind who, when a calf got stuck in the mud down in the draw 3 days after she arrived, came out in the cold without me asking and helped me get it free. She'd seen me from the kitchen window and come down wearing the wrong boots for mud. She didn't own the right kind yet, and just got in there. We got the calf out. She was covered to the knee, and she stood there in the draw looking at the animal finding its feet, and she said, "I grew up on a farm in Ohio. I know what I'm doing." Like she was answering a question I hadn't asked. She was the kind who sat up past dark with a lamp and mended things without being asked to. I'd find work done in the morning that I hadn't asked for and hadn't known was waiting. A belt she'd noticed needed a new hole. Oren's good glove that he'd lost a finger from resewn with a neat seam. She was the kind who asked questions straight. Not intrusive questions, not questions that were looking for something to judge, questions that wanted to know. She asked about the land. Which pasture was better in wet years, which creek ran cold enough in summer for the horses to prefer it. She asked about my father, who'd broken the ground, and when I talked about him, she listened in a way that made me talk more than I'd meant to. She asked about Constance Prout once. Somehow she'd heard something about Constance in town. I don't know how women's information travels by its own network. And I told her short version, and she nodded and said, "That was a long time to be alone," and didn't add anything to it, which was exactly the right amount. She was the kind who laughed at things that were actually funny, rather than things you expected her to laugh at. The first time she laughed around me, it surprised me. I'd said something about the agency, something dry about their routing abilities, and she laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that comes out before you've decided to let it, and she caught herself and looked at me, and I had the strange experience of not minding at all. The trouble with the town started at the end of the second week. I don't know what else to call it except trouble, though it wasn't violent or dramatic. It was the slow, cold, mean kind of trouble that small towns specialize in. I came to understand it bit by bit, the way you come to understand weather. A few things Vera mentioned, casual, like she wasn't quite sure they meant what she thought they meant. The way certain women at the dry goods had looked at her. Something a man outside the saloon had said within her hearing, not quite loud enough to require addressing, just loud enough to make sure she heard. The specific subject was this. There were men in Harlow who thought it was funny that I'd sent for a woman, and thought it was funnier that she'd gotten lost, and thought it was funniest of all that she'd shown up anyway. And some of those men had decided to share these opinions with the town, and a few women had decided the same. The overall impression was that there was something comical about the whole arrangement, specifically, something comical about me being involved in it. Cal Drew, 51 years old, rancher. Been alone so long, he had to order himself a woman from Denver. I'd known this was coming, some version of it. When you live in a small town for 30 years, you know how the gears turn. But knowing it was coming didn't make it easier to hold when it arrived, especially because it was arriving on her. Arriving on a woman who had done nothing wrong and had, in fact, done everything right. I heard the full weight of it on a Friday when I rode in to pick up a part from Harlan's and ran into Perry Stote outside the post office. Perry Stote was a man I'd known since we were boys and had never exactly liked and never exactly disliked, the way you have with some people, a mutual toleration based mostly on geography. He said something to me that day that I won't repeat exactly, but the shape of it was. Why would a woman who looked like that settle for a man like me? And wasn't there something wrong with her? And maybe I should look into what she was running from. I stood on the boardwalk and looked at Perry Stote for what felt like a long time. Then I said, "Perry, I'm going to ask you not to say anything else along those lines about Vera." He said something else. I hit him once, not hard enough to put him down, just hard enough to end the conversation. He sat against the post office wall and looked up at me, and I stood over him and said, "You're going to stop talking about her." He didn't say anything. I walked to Harlan's and got my part. My hand hurt for 2 days. Oren noticed it and didn't say anything, as was his way. What I didn't know until later was that Vera had seen it. She'd been inside the post office getting a letter from her sister in Ohio, and the window was right there, and she'd seen the whole thing. She told me that evening. She came and stood in the kitchen doorway while I was washing up and said, "I saw what you did with Perry Stote today." I said it wasn't anything. She said, "He's been saying things about me for 2 weeks, all over town." I said, "I know." She said, "You didn't tell me." I said, "I didn't want you to think Harlow was all like him." She was quiet for a second, then she said, "It isn't." And she said, "I can fight my own fights, Cal. I've been doing it longer than you've known me." I said, "I know you can." She said, "But you did it anyway." I said, "Yes." Another silence. The fire was going in the stove. The lamp was burning on the table. She looked at me across the kitchen, and there was something in her face that I wasn't used to seeing aimed at me, a kind of careful attention, the way you look at a thing when you're trying to see it clearly, when you're deciding what it actually is. She said, "I got a letter today from the man in Colorado the agency first sent me to." She paused. "He wants me to come there instead. Says Harlow is too far north, too hard a winter. He's got a bigger place. He sent a bank draft." I looked at the floor, then I looked back up at her. She said, "I wrote him back, told him I was already where I was going." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I could. She said, "I got on the wrong train and ended up sick in New Mexico and arrived 11 days early because I'd read enough of the agency's letters to decide I'd rather know sooner than later." She crossed her arms over her chest, not closed off, just settled. "I changed my route on purpose, Cal. I wanted to see the place before I could be dressed up for it." I said, "You came in through the mud." She said, "I came in through the mud." I looked at her. The lamp was behind me now, and the light was on her face. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because the agency sends you a photograph of a man in his good clothes. I wanted to see what he looked like in his work coat." I looked down at my work coat, the one I'd been wearing the day she arrived, the worst one. I said, "That's not a flattering standard." She said, "No, but it's an honest one." And something came up at the corners of her mouth, not quite a smile, just the beginning of one. "You passed it for what it's worth." Reverend Calloway came through on a Thursday in mid-May. It was a warm day, unexpectedly warm, the kind of spring day that feels like it's apologizing for the winter. He married us in the main room in the late afternoon with Oren as witness and a woman from down the valley named Ruth Hennessy, who had made Vera's acquaintance in the weeks previous and brought flowers from her kitchen garden, and cried through most of it, which she seemed to feel the need to apologize for, and which Vera told her she shouldn't. Calloway kept it short, which was what we'd asked. He said what needed saying. Vera stood beside me and addressed the color of winter wheat, the best thing she owned, and she was straight-backed and steady. When Calloway asked if I'd take this woman, I said I would, and when he asked if she'd take this man, she looked at me first before she said it. Not long, just a second, the way you look at something you've already decided on. After Calloway and Ruth Hennessy left and Oren went back to the bunkhouse, we stood on the porch in the warm evening. The sky was going orange over the mountains. The horses were moving in the corral, and we could hear them. She had her hand in mine, which was not something I'd gotten used to yet, the easy fact of another person's hand, of not having to reach for it. She said, "Ruth says the town's changed its mind about you." I said, "About me?" She said, "About you and the whole arrangement. She says people are saying you must have something good in you, or she wouldn't have turned down Colorado." I said, "People said that?" She said, "Ruth says Walt Freeze said you seemed all right about all this from the beginning, which apparently means something." I couldn't say anything to that. I looked at the mountains. She said, "Is it strange, having people talk about you differently?" I thought about it. 11 years of Tuesdays, one set of tracks in the snow, the side of the room where the lamp doesn't reach. I said, "Yes." She squeezed my hand once, not a performance, just a fact. I'd spent 30 years on this land and known it as well as I knew anything, every draw and dry creek, every place the fence liked to go down in a hard wind, the way the light came over the south ridge in October, low and sideways, the color of old brass. I knew it the way you know a thing you've had entirely to yourself for a long time, the way you know it when no one else is looking at it with you. She turned and looked at the mountains with me, her shoulder against mine. The horses settled in the corral. That part I didn't know how to know yet. I was learning. There is something I want to say about the weeks after the wedding, and I'll say it plainly, because that's the only way I know. She made me visible to myself. I don't mean that in a soft way. I mean she would say things, direct things, the kind that catch you off guard and stick, pointing out that I was good with the stock in a way that showed it wasn't just work to me, that I actually knew them, that I had fixed a thing on the creek intake without being asked and without mentioning it, and she'd noticed, and she said, "That's the kind of man you are, Cal," in a tone that wasn't flattery, just observation, the way she'd say, "That pasture drains well," or "Orrin knows what he's doing." A fact she was recording. I had spent a long time being a fact no one was recording. She argued with me, I want to say that too, about the South pasture, which she thought I was underusing, and about the money I was holding back from the Billings cattle market, and about the dog. She wanted a dog, and I said it was too soon after Roy, and she said Roy had nothing to do with it. And we had a real argument in the kitchen that ended with me going out to the barn and her following me 20 minutes later to say that we were going to get a dog and I was going to like it. And she was right on both counts. The dog's name was Clem, and he was useless with the stock, and attached himself to Vera completely, and I liked him immediately and said nothing about it. She wrote to her sister in Ohio regularly, long letters. Once I walked through the kitchen when she was writing one and she covered part of the page with her arm, not quickly, just automatically, the way you do, and then she took her arm away and said, "I was telling her about you." Just that. I said all right and got my coffee and went back outside, and I thought about that sentence for the rest of the day. She went into town with me on Tuesdays. This was new. I hadn't had a Tuesday with anyone in 11 years, and at first it felt strange in a way I couldn't name, like wearing a coat that fit but hadn't broken in. She would go to the dry goods while I got feed, and I would pick her up after, and we would drive back together. She talked sometimes on the drive, and sometimes we were quiet, and both were all right. The quiet especially. The particular quiet of two people who don't need to fill a space. Harlan Gibbs stopped asking me questions about her. He just said good morning when I came in, and once, I remember this specifically, it was a Tuesday in June. A hot day, the valley all yellow and loud with insects, he said. "She's good for you, Cal." Not in the way that meant something sly, but in the flat, matter-of-fact way that Harlan said most things, and I said, "Yes, she is." And that was all, and I walked out with my feed, and the sun hit me in the face, and I stood in it for a second before I climbed up on the buckboard. I'll tell you about the one night that I think about the most. July. The cattle were up on the summer range, and I'd ridden up to check the fence lines, and the whole day had gone wrong in the accumulating way. A break in the north fence, then a second break I hadn't expected. Then one of the young heifers down in a boggy spot near the creek, and the whole afternoon pulling her out. And by the time I came off the mountain, it was well past dark, and I was spent in a way that had something in it that wasn't just the body. The kind of spent where the work is done, but you haven't come back from it yet. Vera was up. She had the lamp going on the table. She'd left supper warm on the stove, which I'd expected, but she'd also left a chair pulled out at the table with a pillow set on it, which I hadn't. Some instinct she'd had, some piece of information about me she'd already gathered, that sometimes a man comes home and needs to put his weight somewhere without having to find it. I came in and sat down without taking my coat off. She brought the plate and sat across from me and didn't say anything for a while, and I ate, and the food was good, and Clem came over and put his head on my boot. Then she said, "Bad day." I said, "2 fences and a heifer." She said, "I can see the heifer." I looked up. She was looking at me. That look she had careful level, seeing the thing straight on. I said, "I'm all right." She said, "I know you are. You're always all right." And then she said, "That must get lonely." I set my fork down. She said, "Being the one who's always all right, I've watched you. You don't put the weight down very often." I sat there. The lamp was burning. Outside, the summer dark, the crickets, Clem's head on my boot. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that it stopped being uncomfortable and became something else. She was still looking at me across the table, not pushing, not waiting in the way that has an edge in it, just present. The way she was, just flatly, practically, honestly there. I said, "I've been alone a long time." She said, "I know." I said, "I don't know how to do this yet." She said, "You're doing it right now." I looked at her. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Just set it there, solid and warm, the way you set a tool down in a place you know you'll pick it up again. No performance in it. just the weight of her hand on my hand and the lamp and the dark outside. "I came here on purpose," she said, "through the wrong train and the fever and New Mexico and the mud. I'm not here because the arrangement said I had to be." She looked at me steady. "I'm here because I looked at you in your worst coat on your worst day and decided you were the man I was looking for. I want you to know that. I want you to carry it." I said, "All right." She said, "All right." I said, "Yes." She didn't move her hand. I didn't move mine. Clem sighed on my boot. The crickets went on outside. I had been on this land since I was 22 years old. I had worked it through dry years and wet years, through loss and loneliness, and the accumulating weight of a life lived by one pair of hands. I had spent 11 years of Tuesdays going into town and coming home again to the side of the room where the lamp didn't reach. She'd come in through the mud. She'd read enough letters to change her own route. She'd turned down Colorado. I sat in that kitchen with her hand on mine and let it mean what it meant. It's been 4 years now as I sit here and tell this. Some things have changed. The South pasture the way she suggested. The dog. The Tuesday drives. The fact that there are 2 cups on the table and 2 sets of tracks in the snow when it comes, and a lamp that throws its light on both sides of the room. Some things haven't changed. The land, the work, the way spring comes late this far north and costs you, and the way summer when it arrives makes you forgive the cost. Oren's still with us, moving slower, talking the same. The creek that runs cold enough for the horses to prefer it still runs cold enough. She's standing at the fence rail right now as I talk, watching the horses in the evening light the same way she has always watched things, straight on, with that particular attention, like she's deciding what they actually are. Clem's at her feet. She has a mug in her hand that I brought her 20 minutes ago, still probably warm. I'm sitting on the porch steps. She knows I'm watching her. She doesn't turn around. The mountains are going dark at the edges, and the sky between the peaks is the color of old copper. And the air has that early fall smell, something cool in it. Something coming, the land getting ready for what's next. I'd spent 30 years knowing this view from only one angle. I know it from 2 now. That's the whole of it, I think. That's what I wanted to say.